I'm Jane Dunnewold, and I'm standing in the middle of a yurt. And this yurt is an art gallery on the Sunshine Coast in beautiful British Columbia at Fibre, which is a compound of yurts featuring classes and lectures and this wonderful art gallery, and owned by Yvonne Stowell, who is a weaver and the proprietress. She invited me a couple of years ago to do an exhibition here, and I'm really pleased with how it looks, and I would like to do about a 10 or 15 minute walkthrough with you and explain some of the work that's included in the exhibition. The show is entitled Quilt, Not Quilt, and it really came out of questioning that's, for me, symbolic on lots of various levels, when things are not what they seem to be. And of course, the quilt is an object that all of us think of, first of all, as a bed covering that warms us. But because of the art quilt movement and because of some of contemporary art in the larger sense, quilts have become objects that hang on the wall and are no longer functional. They're non-functional, inspiring pieces of art in many cases, which is what I've tried to do here. This was all started because I acquired 2 or 3 quilts, and I was at the same time working to figure out how I could create a surface that was hard enough, or looked hard, but still pliable enough that I could stitch through it. And so the piece on my left is a piece that was one of the very early pieces in the evolution of this series. This piece is called Rob Peter to Pay Paul, and this was a real quilt. It was a bed quilt. I purchased a couple of sections. It had been cut up into pieces that are referred to as cutters when you're looking for them on eBay, for example. And my first impulse was to coat the surface of the quilt with a product called spackling, which is actually a little bit like plaster, looks like plaster, but it's actually a kissing cousin of gel medium or acrylic products. Part of how these pieces evolved was that I would coat the piece with spackling, then I would sand the spackling, and then I would begin collaging onto the surface. And as so many things do when you're a creative, as a noun, this began as playing around just to see what would happen and what I could create and what would work. And then it evolved into not only the pieces that you see here, but a whole body of work that for me is not complete. Let's look at the piece next to Rob Peter to Pay Paul. And before we do leave this piece, I want to point out another thing that I think is worth mentioning. All of the quilt titles in this particular show are riffs on what the original patterns were called. Traditional quilt makers named patterns, and those patterns have come down, filtered down through quilt makers over generations. And although this pattern was originally called Rob Peter to Pay Paul, I have taken the name and transferred it or translated it into my new version, which is Loss of Memory, Who Will Pay? The connection there is that so many of my friends and acquaintances have suffered losses to Alzheimer's and to other forms of dementia, and as you'll see, there are cutaways in this surface, and all of that is my pondering what happens to memory as people slip into dementia beyond where we can reach them. And that's a loss. The piece next to that particular piece is the Log Cabin Shuffle, and this is a piece that actually incorporates several different log cabin pattern blocks. And this is from, as the series evolved, I stopped buying the quilts that were already quilts, like the Rob Peter to Pay Paul version, and I started buying blocks because the blocks were easier to assemble. Sometimes when you buy an old quilt, you may have had this experience, or just having a quilt in the family, the inside stuffing or batting has been washed so many times that it's lumpy and bumpy and really hard to work with. I ordered a couple of quilts like that and realized that I couldn't possibly use them with the spackling in the way that I intended, but that there were all these blocks that were available, sometimes in thrift stores and sometimes on eBay, my new friend, where the blocks had never been assembled. No one really wanted to assemble them. It wasn't a top that was already beautiful that somebody could buy and layer and have quilted by a long arm somewhere. They were instead sort of lost soul blocks that were just kind of a story waiting to be told. And And so this piece is an example of that. The blocks were assembled, and then you can see the white surface is the spackling, and in this particular case I added some additional screen printing because that is, of course, part of my background. The next quilt in the exhibition is a quilt called Stargazer 1, and Stargazer 1 is a continuation of buying blocks and then assembling the background, and then in this case adding additional blocks to the surface. And these pieces now have changed away from, of course, the quilts that were assembled, and they're being layered onto my classic eco-felt backing because of the beautiful way that the presentation and the hanging of the piece. So in this particular case, this involves a 9-patch, which is a block made of 9 equal squares. Those were fused onto the backing. I did some additional screen printing, which mimics the gorgeous, I just love the green of those blocks, which were also freestanding, which are some version of one of the many star patterns that are available. This quilt and the one next to it, or the piece, this small piece, is called the Texas Star, which is the original pattern, A Life Well Lived for Ann Richards, who was, of course, our maverick governor for a number of years in Texas. I was a great fan of hers. These quilts represent a kind of a shift again in the way that I was approaching the series, because I hung a quilt, a top, up on the wall in my studio, and when I stepped back and turned to look at it, I realized I had hung the quilt with the backside out, so you could see all the seams. You can see that on this piece. And instead of running and turning the quilt, I thought, oh my gosh, I love looking at those seams, and I wonder what that would look like with spackling on it. And so all of the quilts that evolved later in the series are quilts that do have one more twist in how a quilt could be conceived. Now the outside is the inside, and now the outside has been spackled, and when I spackle over those edges of the seams, I get this wonderful texture that is even more fabulous than what I thought I was doing originally by spackling over the whole quilt. And this is the evolution of ideas that we can experience if we just allow ourselves to continue to play and ask questions and think about what will happen next in the progression of, as the progression, I should say, unfolds. Next to my Texas Star is another version of the Stargazer, and this one is a slightly different configuration, but really the two Stargazers are kissing cousins. Both of them have the seams turned to the outside. Both of them feature the spackling and then the screen print, which was actually made by tracing the pattern that was in this star and making a small silk screen so that I could add that pattern back to the surface. One of the things I love when I stand back from pieces like this, and I haven't really looked at them until I get them from, across the room, is how unexpected a square like this can be, the one that has the red plaid in it. When I spackle over it, I'm so close I don't necessarily see that from across the room that square will pop out. But I love the serendipity and the surprise of having that happen. It's a delight when you back away from a piece in the studio and see parts of it that you didn't do intentionally that are really working out pretty well. That's a cool thing. To the left of the second Stargazer are two of the pieces that were right at the very beginning of this exploration, and it's a diptych. These pieces are called Together Exodus, and they were made specifically with the Stories of Migration and Diaspora exhibition, which was held at the Textile Museum in Washington, D.C., and has just recently been dismantled. And the idea of this piece is each of these squares is a handmade paper or a printed paper of mine, and the progression of the squares across the two panels represented for me ideas and memories, and this the gold that's been added to it in some sense represents for me the memories that we carry with us even when we have moved long distances from our parents and from our families and from the places that we love. When you think, especially being out here in British Columbia, about the people who came across the prairies and in covered wagons and left their loved ones at home and were wrapped up in the quilts that were the memories, because there were pieces of clothing in the quilts that they recognized, and there were the memories of sitting under the quilt frame or talking with the grandmothers and the aunts and the friends who made the quilts. That must have been a very bittersweet experience to know that you might never see those people again. And those were the kinds of thoughts I had when I was working on this particular piece. The next three in the exhibition hung together here are three pieces that also came from what are called cutters, meaning damaged quilts that have been cut into sections and sold basically on eBay. And these three are also quilts that had very recognizable names. And so I was having some fun playing with the names. These are early pieces in the evolution of the series. They are, as I say, quilts through and through, meaning they have a backing and they have a batting inside. The original pattern right here was called Beautiful Star, and that 15 Minutes of Fame popped into my head, and so that's the new name of this particular piece. But this surface includes, again, the handmade and special papers, the gold leaf, and sometimes cutting the paper up into tiny strips in order to mimic the pattern that was already there in the blocks that composed the quilt. The next piece is called Pattern Dance, and this is actually a kind of a boring pattern as far as quilts go, because it was a crazy quilt block. All the blocks were sewn together sort of randomly, and there wasn't really any rhyme or reason to it. And so I had just been working on the Rob Peter to Pay Paul with the beautiful, these beautiful sort of disc shapes, and thought that maybe I could pump up the surface by adding those. I do a lot of drawing with grease pencil and also regular pencil back into the surface, sometimes to enhance the shapes that are here, sometimes rather defiantly, because when I tried to actually hand quilt myself, I couldn't really make it nice. And I'm not much of a seamstress. Basically, I'm a surface designer for a good reason. It's because I can't really sew, never have been that kind of a mind. But I could draw the lines that might represent the quilt lines as I might do it if I was any good at it. And I'm not. The piece next to Pattern Dance is one of my favorites. This one is called Crown of Thorns, and that was the original pattern, because a lot of the old quilt patterns had names that had religious overtones, because I suppose of the backgrounds of the women who were making the quilts. And I loved the pattern, I loved the subtlety of the color, and just about the same time I bought this cutter piece, I found a Sunday school journal from the Presbyterian Church, and so you see these close-ups with the handwriting. Those are literally the pages taken from that Sunday school journal, and the penmanship is amazing, and all it is just a record of everyone who was attending Sunday school and what they did, and it's pretty boring to tell you the truth, but it transformed this piece from Crown of Thorns into my new name, Sunday Morning. The piece next to Sunday Morning is one of the pieces that was just fun to make, and I still had plenty of those 9-patch blocks left, so that became the background. I had this sort of I think this might be called a pineapple, this pattern. I had 4 blocks from the pineapple, fused those together because this was riffing on what had happened when I put the star pattern onto the Stargazer pieces, and it was pretty boring. Enter the pencil to bump up the grid, enter the pencil, the grease pencil, to enhance the blocks that were there, and turned it into a completely different piece. Next to Square Dance is one of my favorites to date. This piece is called February 11th, and it again has the seam sides turned out, but one of the things that I flipped over when I found these blocks online was that it was what is referred to as paper piecing, meaning that all the shapes of the pattern were cut out of paper, and those paper patterns were used to form the cloth pieces so that when they sewed the bits together they could get the points to match, which was really important at a certain point in time. These blocks still had the paper attached, and I never could find a date specifically, but we can see February 11th, and you can see that there are other remaining paper bits still on the surface. And the collage aspect of that and the roughness of that and the historical part of that is all something that made me very, very fond of these blocks and putting them together in this configuration. Next to February 11th is a classic pinwheel pattern, and this is an entire quilt. This perhaps might have been a baby quilt because of the size of it. It's pretty much covered with the paper pieces because the coloring underneath wasn't particularly interesting. It's stiffer than a lot of the others because it is the entire quilt and it was spackled. I'm pleased with the pattern, and you can see how much shapes like these black shapes can punch up the surface so that it makes it a more interesting configuration. This is renamed Crazy Ann Spins Out. Next to Crazy Ann is Metamorphosis, and if anything, all of what I'm doing comes together in this particular piece because several of these blocks were blocks that were actually quilted already, all 3 layers. Several of the blocks are blocks that were just 9-patch pieces that had never been finished, and those evolve into the bottom blocks, which are entirely made of paper. And I love this piece, and I think if anything, it's a signifier for what I'm trying to explore from a symbolic standpoint of when is something historical and when is something current and when is it functional and when is it no longer functional, and what are the paradoxes around that from the standpoint of not only making art but also crafting a life. There are 3 other pieces in the show that I'd like to talk about briefly. And these 3 are all made from the same blocks. Was another one of those lot of blocks where I bought them on eBay and I got, I don't know, maybe 30 of them. And they weren't particularly nice colors, so I decided I'd throw them all in a dye bath, and I threw them in an indigo dye bath, and then they were all the same color of blue, and it was pretty darn boring. And the 3 pieces that evolved were assembled on the felt backing, and I started trying to play. Sometimes for me, writing is helpful, so I was playing with the idea of what a 9-patch is. And so the pieces on the left and right are both kind of riffs on a 9-patch. In the case of the one here on my left, I used sand and gel medium to add the numbers of the 9-patch. On the right, I hand wrote the numbers onto the 9-patch with grease pencil. These 2 pieces are the only pieces in the entire show that were actually machine stitched, and I did it by putting a thicker thread in the bobbin and sewing through from the back side, and I did that prior to adding the spackling, and mainly as an experiment just to see if I could, to tell you the truth. The last piece that we'll talk about here is the piece in the center, and this is of course those same blue blocks, and in this case they're shifting into 3 other blocks here at the bottom, and the spackling disappears into the blue, and the checkerboard that rises out of the whole thing is white sand. And if anything, when I look at a piece like this and I think about how I made it and what I was thinking at the time, I'm struck by how many different approaches there are to making something or achieving an end, I guess. Symbolically, we each have our own path, and there are probably 3 ways to get at any particular problem, which is the name of that piece. So that's the show here in beautiful British Columbia, and I'm grateful to Yvonne and Reggie for hosting me, and I hope you've enjoyed what you've seen, and I hope the trucks racing past on the freeway outside haven't been too much of a distraction, and thank you for taking time to watch the video and share these with me. I'm grateful.